happy family living in small-town America.
We all moved in and we were kind of like the Brady Bunch.
Until they were stricken by a mysterious and life-threatening illness.
Doctors are stumped as to what's happening. Could she be patient zero?
They done tests and everything, but for a long time, we had no idea what was wrong with us.
But what looked like a possible outbreak ended up being more sinister than anyone could have imagined.
All it said was, you and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you will die.
He thought he was smarter than everyone, including the police.
October 1988. In Winter Haven, Florida, 41-year-old Peggy Carr is rushed to the hospital by her family after she collapsed in pain.
She couldn't talk. She couldn't hardly move. She's known sign language all of her life because her parents were deaf. So she signed to me and my sister about how bad she was hurting.
She was in such excruciating pain, she had to be physically carried into the ER.
At first they thought it was the flu, and then they recognized this is more than the flu. There's something going on here.
Doctors were mystified because you don't see that typically in an ER. They ask her, what was your last meal? Did you drink some water that maybe you typically didn't drink? They have to ask her all of these questions, and they still can't find the answer. It was bizarre.
They just could not isolate it down until they brought in a neurologist who suggested that it was some kind of poisoning.
Peggy Carr was a hard-working mother of 3 from Fort Meade, Florida.
My mom always smiled. She was a people person. She was always happy, and she always took good care of us kids.
Peggy and her first husband, Larry, had been married 14 years. They had 2 sons and a daughter, but the marriage didn't last.
He got in trouble all the time, and he wasn't the best husband. He was always drinking. He was an alcoholic, and she just got tired of it.
After the divorce, Peggy got a job waitressing at the local diner and focused on raising her kids. But it wasn't easy.
We would come to her restaurant, she would serve us, and she was a super hard worker. She was always working. It seemed like she would have 12, 14-hour shifts.
A new romance was the last thing on Peggy's mind.
I remember her telling me that she met this great guy. His name was Pat. He used to frequent the restaurant because it's right there where his work was at. He would come in and flirt with her.
Most everyone called him Pie. He was a foreman at a phosphate mine, and after his shift, he would go to the diner and sit in her section. It turned out they had a lot in common. He was divorced with kids of his own, so it wasn't that surprising when they started dating.
I remember him coming to pick up my mom, and he had a Monte Carlo SS, which I fell in love with. So I just thought he was the coolest thing.
After dating for several months, the two decided to get married in 1988. Peggy and her 3 children moved in with Pi, his adult daughter, and his teenage son, Travis. The blended family of 7 made their home in the nearby town of Alturas.
It's a happy little town. We had a Circle K. There's a nice little church, dirt roads. Everybody's friendly. Everybody waves when they go by each other. Just a really good place to have a family.
People there leave their doors unlocked. Their windows are open.
Everybody knows everybody in Alturas, and they like it that way.
And I remember us referring to the Brady Bunch, We had a big table, and it was always full of food. My mom was happy, and, she had a good man, and we had more brothers and sisters, so we were all happy at the time.
The kids would often invite friends over, and it wasn't uncommon for the gatherings to spill out into their yard. But Peggy didn't mind. She enjoyed welcoming people into her home.
We were typical teenagers. We had pool parties. It was always loud over there. We were working on our trucks in the driveway. We were riding our 3-wheelers.
But the Carr family's happiness wouldn't last forever. Now, Peggy has been poisoned, and authorities need to know how it happened.
Then her 2 sons started to exhibit symptoms as well.
Me and Travis, our feet were killing us. You could just barely graze our feet, and we would just, holler.
At that point, everyone is extremely concerned. Is this the start of some sort of widespread contamination?
Coming up, detectives suspect Peggy may have been poisoned by the person she trusted most.
They suspected he was having an affair. He had the motive to do it.
"41-year-old Peggy Carr and her 2 teenage sons have been hospitalized after exhibiting symptoms of a severe poisoning, as doctors search for the source of their suffering.
For a long time, it seemed like we had no idea what was wrong with us. And we were just freaking out, and, it's just really scary.
Finally, doctors receive lab results that reveal the suspected poison.
The lab results show that Peggy Carr was poisoned with thallium nitrate.
It is a toxic heavy metal. It causes your nerves and muscles to shrivel and die.
I think they run 1,000 tests on us. She had like 55 times the amount that it takes to kill one human. I had like 19 times, and Travis had like 25 times the amount. That's what they told us.
The amount of poison that she had, what it was doing to her, essentially, it was killing her on the inside. Her body was decomposing.
Thallium is most commonly used in rat poison, so the first thought was that she had been accidentally contaminated. But it's rare to have something like this happen to one person. So to have 3 from the same family, that couldn't be a coincidence. So everyone was on high alert. County officials, along with local law enforcement, were looking into what could be an enormous public health crisis.
But finding the source of the poison won't be easy.
It's very hard for anybody to detect because you can't smell it, it's odorless, and it's tasteless.
The rat poison containing thallium has been outlawed since 1972, so it's difficult to come by.
There were all sorts of theories of how this family could have come in contact with such a high concentration of a dangerous chemical, and they had to look into all of them.
Is there something toxic in the air, in the water? Or what if it was something from the mine in this community?
Authorities also had to consider the frightening possibility of widespread contamination.
This came not long after the initial poisoning of the Tylenol in Chicago using cyanide. And then there were other instances of tampering with commercial products like that. So naturally, detectives were concerned.
I can remember Mr. Mincy, Ernie Mincy, telling me, we got CSI at your house right now, and we're checking everything from mustard and mayonnaise.
More than 400 items were taken from the Carr home and sent to a state lab in Jacksonville for testing. Food from the refrigerator, ice cubes from the freezer, even scrapings from the floors and walls. But it was going to take a while for the results to come back.
In the meantime, the Polk County Sheriff's Office begins their own investigation.
They come in, ask us a ton of questions. Do we have any people that don't like us? Do we have any enemies? And of course we said no, because, we were kids.
Peggy was well liked. She lived in that community. She grew up in that community. So what possible motive would someone have?
Unfortunately, Peggy couldn't give them any answers. The poison had taken a toll on her, and she could not communicate.
But Peggy's family had plenty to say, and according to them, the Carr's marriage wasn't as perfect as it appeared to be.
They were good out of the gate. Everything seemed to be going fine. She found Prince Charming. Then he started to not be around as much, not be as affectionate.
They'd only been married 6 months, and there were already rumors that her husband was having an affair. She was very troubled by it, devastated by it.
When she found out that he was cheating, I don't think she confronted either one of them. I think she was just mad and sad. They were so quick to get married, so quick to fall in love and then so quick to forget why they fell in love in the first place.
Peggy was kind, but she wasn't weak. She refused to let Pi treat her that way, so she took her kids to go stay in a hotel.
But it wouldn't be long before Peggy had a change of heart.
He did come to the hotel crying, begging her, he'll change, just smoozing her, trying to get her to come back home.
She ultimately decided to give him a second chance and move back into their house with the kids. But things were different after that.
They weren't holding hands, and, she didn't seem like she was smitten anymore. She seemed like she was troubled about her marriage. It was very hard for me to see her like that. She was just so depressed all the time.
According to Peggy's son, Dwayne, her depression turned to fear when she discovered Pi had been keeping another secret from her.
She found out he took out a large life insurance policy on her. She talked to me a couple times about how she was scared.
You have to wonder if he could have been trying to kill his wife for the insurance money and accidentally poisoned the kids as well.
Early on in the investigation, Pi was definitely a suspect. He was considered by the sheriff's office very closely.
Before they question Pi, investigators have the rest of the family tested.
They have to make sure everyone who's been affected is receiving treatment. Depending on how many people have been poisoned, any possible charges against him could change as well.
Everybody who was living in that house pretty much was affected by it. They all had traces of thallium in their systems on several different levels.
One of the test results is especially surprising.
It turned out Pi had been poisoned as well. It's hard to know what to make of this. Does it mean he's innocent as well? Or does it show just how much planning he put into this?
People are sinister enough that, sure, why not just eat a little bit of the poison myself to throw detectives off the trail? Like, look, there's no way I would poison my wife because I suffered from it too.
Pi isn't the only one. Trace amounts of thallium were found in the entire family. But only Peggy, her son Dwayne, and Pi's son Travis were affected enough to need medical treatment.
One of the primary reasons the detectives working this case considered Pi less of a suspect is because his own son Travis had become so ill. He was probably the most affected by the thallium after Peggy. There was certainly a question of why would someone do that to his own son.
With Pi cleared as a suspect, police wonder who could have hated the cars enough to poison them. Coming up, a mysterious note will expose a new suspect.
You would have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you will all die. This is no joke.
It's been several days since Peggy Carr and her sons were admitted to Winter Haven Hospital with thallium poisoning, and doctors are struggling to keep them alive.
The thallium in her system, it affected her in many ways. Her hair began to fall out just in clumps. She lost a lot of weight, and it finally just took such a toll that they had to put her into a coma in order for her to even tolerate the side effects.
Travis and Dwayne had less of the poison in their systems, but they weren't doing too well either.
We started losing our hair. I couldn't walk at the time. I'm just waiting for one of us to go into a coma or get sicker.
About 5 months before Peggy got sick, the family received a letter in the mail that was just a typed note that stated, "You and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you will all die."
It was a little post-it. We was at the table eating. My mom was kind of freaked out. I thought it was funny. My buddies and my brother thought it was funny.
The letter provides detectives with a clue to help find the person threatening the cars.
Alturas is a very small community. So all the mail that comes through Alturas has to go through another community called Bartow.
The letter was specifically addressed to Pi Carr in Bartow, which only someone familiar with the local address system would know. So they were looking for someone local.
It looked like there was somebody outside of their family who was threatening them.
Polk County doesn't really see a whole lot of crime, and as a result, the sheriff's department is pretty small. They needed more resources to help with the investigation, so they called in the FBI for assistance.
The FBI took the elements of this crime to the Behavioral Sciences Unit and asked them if they could come up with a profile.
They said that it was a white male in his 30s, very high IQ, who liked to leave a trail of threats and liked to watch from a distance and see the victims in the case suffer.
It doesn't take long for investigators to come up with another lead.
Detectives, as well as the FBI, interview people in the neighborhood to see if they can gain some information that may have been missed the first time around. And then lo and behold, a witness told them that Peggy actually had an argument with her neighbor Diana, and it was a heated one.
Diana lived next door to the Carrs with her husband, George. They apparently didn't like all the noise and commotion going on over there on a regular basis.
We were doing donuts in the driveway, me and a couple friends and my brother, Travis. And we had the music really loud, just being teenagers. And I remember she walked over and she said, oh my God, y'all need to turn that down.
Diana was rather insistent that Peggy needed to rein in her kids. And they had a shouting match.
My mom tried to keep her cool, because you don't want to make your next door neighbor mad. But she was really defensive at her because she was trying to protect her children, basically.
At the time, it appeared to be a simple neighborhood argument. But in light of recent events, detectives are interested in hearing what George and Diana Trapal have to say.
When police went over there, George answered the door. He was a short, middle-aged white man with thick glasses and a gray beard. He sort of looked like an aging hippie.
He and Diana had been married for about 8 years. They liked their solitude. They liked living out in the country, kind of on their own. They were very active in the Mensa group, and that was kind of their social outlet.
He is a computer programmer and a technical writer. He works from 7 a.m. until at night. His life is his job.
He told detectives that his office was right next to his wife's orthopedic surgery practice in Bartow, which is about 7 or 8 miles away from Alturas.
During the interview, the detectives and the FBI discovered that George Trapal had lived next door to the Carrs for several years. They also discovered during that time that he didn't like them very much. He actually didn't like them at all.
George's answers immediately raised investigators' suspicions.
He would shake. He made some unusual noises with his mouth, almost like a clucking noise, as if he had dry mouth.
He appeared to be very nervous, and innocent people are nervous.
He said a lot of things during the interview that could have been taken as a motive, but one thing in particular stood out.
When he was asked why somebody would want to hurt the Carr family, he told detectives that he thought somebody probably just wanted them to move away.
Any average person would probably say, oh my gosh, I have no idea why anybody would want to poison her. Instead, George Trapal came back and gave them a reason.
A reason known only to police and the person who wrote the death threat.
George Trapal looked like a bookworm, not someone who would poison his next-door neighbors. But looks can be deceiving.
Coming up, detectives identify the source of the poison.
The entire family drank out of those bottles.
It's a chilling thought. Someone had snuck into the house and left these bottles full of poison.
The The FBI and Polk County Sheriff's Department are considering George Trepal and his wife as suspects in the poisoning of Peggy Carr and her children.
At the hospital, doctors were still treating Peggy Carr and her 2 sons. She'd been put in a medically induced coma to help combat the effects of the poison.
Dwayne and Travis were slowly improving, but Peggy just continued to get worse. The thallium was just too deeply embedded in her system that she just couldn't overcome it.
She was on a ventilator and they were keeping her alive. No brain activity. It just wasn't Mom there anymore.
On March 3rd, 1989, almost 5 months after falling ill, Peggy Carr was disconnected from life support. She died shortly thereafter.
Not only is it a heavy blow for the family to take, but it also means the FBI and Florida police are officially investigating a homicide now. George and Diana Trepal seem to have motive, but they still have no idea how the cars were poisoned.
But that would change when the test results came back on the hundreds of items police had taken from the Carr home.
The lab techs were able to isolate the source of the poison. It turned out to be some Coke bottles that were left in the kitchen. And they all contained thallium nitrate.
We used to have this little cubby hole where, we put extra cases of water, whatever, and that's where it was.
The next question was, how did the poison get into those bottles? It definitely wasn't something that happened at the bottling plant, so they're looking for signs of tampering.
We are talking about Coke bottles where you've got to pop it open. So the person who did this actually had to find a way to pop open the Coke bottle, pour in the poison, and then get the cap back on. Forensics was able to determine that a small screwdriver blade was used to open up those Coke bottles.
It had been done so skillfully that Peggy and her family never realized the danger they were in.
In October of 1988, Peggy thought she had the flu, and her family was trying to take care of her to make her feel better. Part of that was by bringing her Coca-Cola pretty frequently, thinking that would settle her system. And the worse she felt, the more Coke they gave her, thinking that would make her feel better.
Of course, the irony is they were poisoning her to death while poisoning themselves, too.
But Peggy's sons tell police they should have been more suspicious.
My mother loved Pepsi, not Coke. She always had to have her Pepsi. She was a caffeine addict, So there was never Coke in the house.
With so many kids coming in and out of the house, nobody thought twice about it at the time. Any one of their friends could have brought those drinks over. But in hindsight, it's a chilling thought. Someone had snuck into the house and left these bottles full of poison.
Could that someone be the Carr's seemingly harmless neighbor, George Trepal?
He certainly struck them as suspicious when they spoke to him the first time. But the police know very little about him at that point, so they put a surveillance team on him.
George Trepal is a very intelligent man. They were very active in the Mensa group, and that was kind of their social outlet.
Mensa is comprised of a group of individuals that rank in the top 2% of intelligence levels in the country.
One of the first things detectives realize is that George has been keeping secrets from them.
Initially, he told detectives that his office was right next to his wife's orthopedic surgery practice in Bartow.
The fact is, he worked from home. There was no office in Bartow. It's a strange thing to lie about for no apparent reason. But if he's lying about that, what else is he hiding?
Detectives also start looking into his background. They learned in 1975, he actually served time in prison for dealing amphetamine. The DEA agent suspected that Trepal was the mastermind behind the amphetamine production.
That's significant because thallium sulfate is sometimes used by chemists who are illegally making amphetamines.
With all this information coming in, detectives have to be thinking, this guy matches the FBI profile, 41 years old, highly intelligent, he is well-versed on poisons.
But it isn't enough to get a search warrant or make an arrest. Detectives need to find hard evidence linking Trepal to the crime.
The Polk County Sheriff decided to send someone undercover to get closer to George. Officer Susan Gorek was chosen for the job.
She had been with the Sheriff's Department for several years at that point. She's very intelligent. She's very astute. She's very quick. And they felt like she would be able to fit into a Mensa group.
From their surveillance, they knew that he and his wife were planning a murder mystery weekend for their local Mensa chapter. It was the perfect opportunity for Susan to introduce herself.
She became Sherry Gwynn, a very lonely woman going through a horrible, messy divorce in Texas. She wanted to get away from all of that, so she moved to the small community in Florida. It could not have gone better. It was like the gods were on her side. She walks into the location of this murder mystery weekend, and lo and behold, you know who hands her the pamphlet? George Trepal.
When Susan reads the details of George's voodoo-themed murder mystery, she can hardly believe her eyes.
A passage in the document read, "Few voodooists believe they can be killed by psychic means, but no one doubts that he can be poisoned. When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic."
She went there hoping to gain George's trust and to start gathering information. She didn't expect him to give her a full confession.
It's right there in black and white. It is like George Trepal is actually bragging about the murder of Peggy Carr.
Coming up, an undercover agent tries to avoid becoming her target's next victim.
She was with a cold-blooded killer, and she knew she had to keep her guard up.
Investigators believe 40-year-old computer programmer George Trepal is actually the mastermind of a deadly plot to murder his noisy neighbors. To prove it, they've sent undercover officer Susan Gorek to befriend him.
She basically strokes George Trepal's ego. It was a way to get close to him. She appeared needy. She needed a friend. She needed someone that could guide her. I think he embraced that role.
The murder mystery weekend went as well as anyone could have hoped. Susan did manage to get close to Trepal, but aside from the pamphlet, she wasn't able to come up with any incriminating evidence. He didn't confide in her or let anything slip.
To catch Peggy's killer, it seems Susan will have to keep up the charade a little longer.
George Trepal's wife is a doctor. She's not home a lot. He has all the time in the world. So all of a sudden, these two start doing things together. They start cementing their friendship. They do things like go to the Salvador Dali Museum in St. Petersburg. They go out to dinner in restaurants in Ybor City. They even have picnics at a lake nearby.
She understood the things that George was interested in so that she could bring him up. Things like photography and science fiction and plants and botany and things like that.
Every single day, she's getting closer and closer to George Trepal. And every single day, he's getting closer and closer to her.
But Susan knows that even the slightest mistake could cost her everything.
Susan never let her guard down. She always knew she was with a cold-blooded killer.
When they would go out to dinner or they would go out to lunch, if she had to use the ladies' room and she came back, she never touched her water, her coffee, any food she left on her plate.
This goes on for quite a while, and George still hasn't told her anything they can use. It's looking like he's either innocent or he's on to her and even smarter than they thought.
This was supposed to be an 8-week undercover assignment. It's turning into 8 months.
Investigators are determined to bring Peggy's killer to justice, but their undercover operation seems to have hit a standstill.
Susan spent countless hours with him, and they just poured a lot of effort into this. They hoped they would come away with a confession, but unfortunately that never came.
Something had to give. They didn't want to let him get away with murder, but they were running out of ideas and resources.
Until suddenly, after 9 months of being undercover, Susan's hard work seems to finally pay off.
Out of the blue one day, George tells Susan that his wife moved her practice from Bartow to the neighboring town of Sebring. They're planning to move to a new house so she can be closer to work.
Susan saw an opportunity. She brought in her abusive marriage and the need for a place to live. And that prompted Trepal to suggest that she rent his house in Alturas. And that's exactly what happened.
Access to Trepal's home gives detectives the break they've been waiting for.
They search every room of that house looking for evidence to link him to the poisoned Coke bottles. And they find a workbench. Inside is a small brown vial containing a white crystal substance.
They test it immediately, and it ends up being thallium. Now they have strong, concrete evidence to issue an arrest warrant.
On April 5th, 1990, over a year after Peggy Carr's death, George Trepal is arrested for murder.
It was early in the morning when FBI agent Brad Brecky and Sheriff's Office Detective Ernie Mincy went down to Sebring to take George into custody. When they got there, Diana would not let them in the house. She virtually used her own body to barricade the front door.
They had to restrain her. They go into the house. They see George Trepal standing at the foot of the stairs in bikini briefs. They ask him to put on some clothes, and finally, they arrest him.
Among the books they found when they were searching through George's house down in Sebring was a book entitled Poison Detection in Human Organs. And there was a chapter on thallium, and there was indication that he had been interested in that particular chapter.
It wasn't quite a smoking gun, but as far as circumstantial evidence goes, it was pretty strong. This guy had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. And he had an ego big enough to make him think he could get away with it.
Coming up, the case against George Trepal takes an unexpected turn.
Pieces of his past were not allowed to be presented at his trial.
After a year-long investigation, the FBI and Florida police have charged George Trepal with the murder of his next-door neighbor, Peggy Carr.
The indictments included 1 count of first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, in addition to multiple counts of tampering with a consumer product.
On January 7th, 1991, over 2 years after Peggy Carr first fell ill, George Trepal's murder trial begins.
State Attorney John Aguero called a total of 49 witnesses to testify, including experts from Coca-Cola, doctors who treated Peggy Carr, family members, and the DEA agent who arrested Trepal on the amphetamine charges back in 1975.
The prosecution presented a very methodical case to the jury. They presented it in such a way that each element built on the previous element.
The evidence they found on its own, it may mean nothing, but you have to take a look at the totality. And there are just too many coincidences.
In order to believe that George Trepal was innocent, you had to believe that it was just a coincidence that there's a bottle of thallium in his shed. That it's just a coincidence that he's got a book that has a chapter on death by poisoning. That it's purely coincidence that this letter shows up at the Carr household, and 5 months later, Trepal mentions something about, well, somebody was just trying to get them to move out of the neighborhood.
The state's attorney posits that when the Carr family ignored his warnings, George decided to take matters into his own hands.
He conjured an image of Trepal at the workbench in his garage, carefully cooking the thallium, adding it to the soda bottles, and then crimping the caps back on. He theorized that Trepal left the tainted beverages in the car home, knowing that eventually they would drink it.
But the defense argues that prosecutors have no physical evidence proving George had anything to do with the poisoning.
They suggested that the police, who had invested enormous manpower into the case, singled out George because he was different, and then twisted the facts and coached witnesses to suit their theory.
George Trepal's defense attorneys were able to bring in some inconsistencies in this case, including statements made by Travis Carr. He said when he was in the hospital that he was the one that brought the Coke bottles home.
George's lawyers even suggest there was a much more likely suspect, one investigators conveniently overlooked.
Eventually, they brought in Diana, George's wife, and painted her as a possible scapegoat for George, that she was behind it and not him. And he was obviously upset about that he did not want her to be brought into the trial. But the lawyers felt like that was necessary.
This could give him an avenue out. I mean, she blocked the door and did not want detectives entering their home. She also yelled and screamed at Peggy Carr. She is also extremely intelligent. She's part of this Mensa Society, and she's a surgeon.
She had just as much reason to want to get rid of the Carrs and had more skill and knowledge than her husband. They argued that the thallium found in the home could just as easily have belonged to her.
On February 6th, 1991, the jury comes back with a verdict.
I remember standing next to Susan Gorick when the jury came back in. And I remember looking at her at one point and saying, "Susan, breathe." She was just holding her breath. And I think all of us were kind of collectively holding our breath because there was a lot riding on this verdict. And the jury wasn't out real long for as complicated as this trial was.
It turned out they didn't have anything to worry about. The jury found him guilty on each and every count.
The jury convicted Trepal of the first-degree murder of Peggy Carr, and they also found him guilty of attempted murder on each of the others in the family.
1 month later, George Trepal receives his sentence.
The jury recommended by a vote of 9-3 that George should die for the death of Peggy Carr.
Florida is one of the few states in the country that did not have to have a unanimous verdict for death. Now we do. So now all 12 of the jurors have to agree to death, and then the judge signs off on it. At the time that George Trepal was going to trial, it was not the case.
One man's sinister plot for revenge had torn a family apart and left their Florida community forever changed.
I was young. You shouldn't have to put up with garbage like that when you're 15 years old. You should worry about dances and proms or whatever, you know. Me and my brother and my sister were alone most of our life because our dad was never around. So she was the only thing that we had, you know, that was stable in our lives.
I don't think a community ever recovers from a crime like this. You're always going to be talking about it. It changes your view on safety. If it could happen to Peggy Carr, a 41-year-old waitress just trying to put food on the family table and take care of the family, something like this could happen to anybody.
For the outdoors.
There's deer all the time, turkeys, raccoons. There's a lot of wildlife in our neighborhood.
He especially liked the deer. He built a custom feeder, and that's where he kept the corn.
Until his disgruntled neighbor decided to put an end to his hobby.
I come home, there's dead growing.
And when it's one dead animal, it's easy to think it's a coincidence, but it didn't stop there.
And when their feud ends in bloodshed, investigators must determine who's to blame.
It wasn't something that was happening over the course of a couple months. These guys had been at it for years.
It's the Hatfields versus the McCoys, and it was just one of those perfect storms.
May 5th, 2014. It's a quiet Monday evening in the picturesque town of New Brighton, Minnesota. Sean Bortel and his wife are tucking their children into bed. But at 8:32 p.m., their domestic routine is shattered by the sounds of gunfire.
It was boom, 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 boom. And I froze. And it's not uncommon to hear fireworks or things like that in the neighborhood. And my wife immediately said, "Those are gunshots, call the police."
911, where's your emergency?
I think somebody just fired a gun near our house, like 4 shots.
While the operator takes the Bortel's information, a much more urgent call comes in.
911, where's your emergency?
They're shooting us, hurry!
What needs an ambulance?
I'm getting shot, yes!
On the phone is 48-year-old Jennifer Clevin. She says she and her boyfriend, 46-year-old Todd Stevens, were outside their house when a gunman opened fire.
She ran inside, injured and bleeding, and she picked up the phone, called 911.
Can you tell me if the man that did this is still there?
He's shooting through my house! I'm scared to go near the window!
Okay, Jennifer, we have a lot of help on the way, okay?
We get here now!
Her longtime partner had been shot. She didn't know if he was still alive. I can only imagine how frightened and upset she was.
Police and paramedics quickly arrive to find Todd Stevens lying on the ground, unresponsive.
They have to get in there and keep themselves safe, assess the situation, determine if there's an active shooter. Even if the shooting itself is over, who did it? Where did it come from?
Todd Stevens was a longtime resident of New Brighton. In fact, he was raised on the same block where he and Jennifer now lived.
The neighborhood is pretty small. Everyone's very close. There's older families, younger families with kids. Like I have people who have lived there their whole lives.
Todd and I had talked quite a bit about his history in the neighborhood. He grew up in the house that we had purchased. He had moved into the house that he had while his parents lived next door to him for some time.
The couple had first met 18 years before in 1996.
Jennifer was a single mom with a young son. She just moved from Texas to Minnesota, and Todd was a short-haul truck driver. They hit it off pretty quickly. Todd was good with Jennifer's son, Ryan. So when the relationship grew more serious, they moved in to Todd's house. They hadn't gotten married yet, but they weren't any less of a family. Jennifer described their life together as wonderful.
Todd was an avid outdoorsman and often took Jennifer and Ryan camping, but they didn't have to go very far to enjoy the wilderness.
New Brighton is a wooded area near several lakes and preserves.
We have Rice Creek right across the street from my home. There's deer all the time, turkeys, raccoons. It's just, there's a lot of wildlife in our neighborhood, and that's part of what makes the neighborhood great.
Todd liked having all the animals around, but he especially liked the deer. He built a custom deer feeder where he kept it full of corn.
I definitely saw more deer, partly because they used our yard to walk to get to the corn. My kids thought it was cool.
In addition to his deer feeder, Todd was also well known for his outgoing personality.
He was incredibly friendly. He loved his beer. He actually seemed more friendly after having a number of beers, but not once had I seen Todd irate.
According to most people, Todd and Jennifer appeared to be ordinary neighbors.
Todd was incredibly helpful. One of my daughters had a flat tire. He helped out with that. We had a swing set. Todd came over and brought tools and helped out with that. So in general, it was a typically positive, neighborly relationship.
But now Todd is bleeding to death after being gunned down outside his home.
When first responders got there, some helped Jennifer while others went to Todd to administer CPR. The whole time, they don't know if they have an active shooter situation, and it is very tense.
While officers try to secure the area, another call comes in.
911, where's emergency?
Someone's shot.
What's your name?
You'll find out.
Coming up, Minnesota police find themselves in a standoff with the gunman.
It's quite surprising for the shooter to call 911.
In New Brighton, Minnesota, police and paramedics have descended upon the home of Todd Stevens and Jennifer Clevin, both victims of an unexplained shooting.
My wife and I heard Jennifer scream. We were really afraid. We didn't know if there were people loose in the neighborhood. Who were these people? Who did the shooting?
While first responders try to administer first aid, 911 operators are fielding another call about the attack.
All right, do you think you shot him?
Are there. I'm not going to shoot the police or anything.
I'm sorry, what?
I said I'm not going to shoot the police. The police are already here. They can go help the guy.
Even though the caller won't tell them who he is, it's pretty clear through the context that they are talking to the gunman. So they try to keep him on the line and try to keep him talking.
Who is the guy that's outside?
Todd Stevens. Nobody listens to me around here. I told the guys that he's going to shoot us. He's got guns. And I just had enough.
Okay. Are you planning on doing something to yourself?
No.
Are you willing to let the police come in?
Not the New Brighton police.
He wasn't going to surrender to the New Brighton police because he thought they were a bunch of, quote, kooks.
Neil said he already spoke to police earlier that day and told them about the threats that Todd made against him, but they ignored him.
Todd was telling the neighbors that he was going to shoot you?
He was going to shoot me, yeah.
Can I ask what your name is?
Neil Zumberg.
57-year-old Neil Zumberg lives across the street from Todd and Jennifer, and he's currently holed up in his house with a gun.
It wasn't just a random attack in a random neighborhood. There was one suspect with a gun who had a target.
For the next half hour, you have a 911 dispatcher on the phone with him, and outside, you have a police commander trying to talk him down. By the end of it, you had law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions outside of his home ready for anything.
Where is the gun that's in the house right now? I just want to make sure officers know so that it doesn't endanger you.
Well, you don't care about me.
I care. We don't want anything to happen to you.
But you don't care about me. I know you don't.
But just as officers are preparing to storm the house, there's a breakthrough.
A dispatcher coordinates with the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department and somehow gets Neil to agree to give himself up then to sheriff's deputies instead of the local police.
In the end, he just stepped out of his house with his hands up and went outside quietly.
While Neil is taken in for questioning, investigators begin to process the crime scene.
From Todd and Jennifer's wounds and the damage to the house, it looked like a shotgun was used in the attack.
The house was struck several times by pellets. They also entered the residence and were lodged in the living room of the house. The front door, the screen door, the glass was shattered.
Outside the corner of the house, they found 4 spent shotgun shells.
They mark all the shells and they have to take all their photographs. The shooter was 125 feet away across the street.
A search of Neil's house turns up 3 possible weapons.
Neil Zumberg had 3 long guns. Those were from his father. One was a shotgun, one was a deer rifle. I think there might have been another shotgun as well.
One of the shotguns, a Browning 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun, was found in the Zumberg's basement on a chair. Neil's fingerprints were found on the gun and the shells were a match.
But what caused the bad blood between these two neighbors in the first place? As investigators speak to the other local residents, they begin to get a clearer picture.
It was just a normal day. I was outside in my backyard with my dogs. I knew right away that it was gunshots, and it was an odd sound for our neighborhood. So immediately I thought of Todd and Neil. It seemed like that's the direction where it was coming from.
This was not the first time that these two families had gotten into it with each other. His wife, Paula, also locked horns with Todd's girlfriend, Jennifer, as well.
In fact, Paula Zumberg had been spotted fleeing the area just after the shooting occurred.
My wife had looked outside to see Paula near the edge of her lawn, looking across the street at Todd's house, going to her car and then driving away.
It turned out that Paula and Jennifer were also overheard having a loud argument earlier that day, so police had to wonder if that also played a part.
As the police investigation begins to unfold, they're sort of discovering that there's this feud that's playing into what had happened. It wasn't something that just happened over the course of a week. It wasn't something that was happening over the course of a couple months. These guys had been at it for years.
What kind of feud could have led to this level of violence?
From an outsider's perspective, it was hard to know who had said what, which threats had actually been made, who was actually afraid. I think things had just gotten blown so out of proportion.
Coming up, a double shooting becomes a murder investigation.
Everyone was just very confused and shocked and surprised.
46-year-old Todd Stevens and his girlfriend, Jennifer Clevin, have both been shot by their neighbor. Unfortunately, Todd's wounds proved to be fatal.
Todd had also been hit several times with a shotgun blast, so he had wounds to his head, to his chest, to his abdomen, and his extremities. He bled to death before they could do much for him.
Jennifer is luckier.
Thankfully, her injuries weren't as serious. She was hit twice with the buckshot. One of the pellets went through the right side of her abdomen and the other her left.
While doctors tend to Jennifer's wounds, investigators ask her to help them figure out how the shooting occurred.
She had a first row seat as a witness to what happened. She was a victim of the shooting, and she was, a part of this feud for all those years.
But the first thing they had to do was break the bad news to Jennifer. It's hard to imagine to lose your boyfriend of 20 years, but then to also be an eyewitness to his murder.
Is Todd dead? I'm sorry, he has passed away. It's for...
Jennifer says they lived across the street from the Zumbergs for over 17 years. And at first, the two families got along well.
Todd and Jennifer were in the neighborhood first. The Zumbergs bought their home, I believe, in 1998.
Neil was a physical therapist, and his wife Paula also worked in healthcare. They had 2 boys and a girl.
The Zumbergs would come to Todd Stevens' house and have cookouts and what have you.
One of the Zumberg sons, Jacob, even became best friends with Jennifer's son, Ryan.
He was raised in my house with my son. I love Jake.
Over the years, however, Jennifer says Neil became increasingly hostile towards them for what seemed to be nothing more than a simple disagreement.
Todd's deer feeder was directly in his front yard, so next to our house, and of course in plain sight of Neil's yard.
Mr. Zumberg did not like the victim and his girlfriend feeding the deer. He didn't like that because the deer would come into the yards, pass through his property.
Zumberg tried to argue that feeding the deer was illegal, but the truth was, he didn't like having them around. He just saw them as pests.
It's not illegal to feed wildlife, especially deer. You're just using corn.
But Neil decided he was going to put a stop to it anyway.
According to Jennifer, around 2012, Neil Zumberg started a campaign of retaliation and of harassment to make them stop feeding the deer.
When intimidation didn't work, Jennifer says Neil went after the source of the problem.
My deer feeder came missing.
If they weren't going to listen to reason, Neil just figured he'd destroy the damn thing. But Todd wasn't the type of person to just let that go.
Good old Todd, he got some PVC pipe and poured some concrete in the ground and put a new one in there.
There were multiple deer feeders, I think, that were broken. I don't think it was just one incident.
Then, as the skirmish continued, a mysterious letter was delivered.
Everyone in the neighborhood got a letter in their mailbox the same day. It was a Xerox copy.
When we moved in, we received a letter, and I believe the letter initially sent was anonymous, although hand-scrawled with a prescription for Neil on there, sort of referred to as the Mr. Corn letter, because Mr. Zumberg referred to Todd as Mr. Corn because he would feed the deer with corn.
The letter accused Todd of endangering the health and well-being of the entire neighborhood.
Deer can carry ticks that cause Lyme disease in humans. And in page 2 of the letter is a copy of the prescription that Neil's doctors gave him to treat it.
Neil Zumberg felt that he got Lyme disease because of the deer coming through his yard, going to Todd Stevens' house to feed on the corn. He was very angry about it.
This went way beyond a dispute between two households. I mean, to try and get all your neighbors involved, that's throwing fuel on a fire.
But that wasn't enough for Neil Zumberg.
He sent a copy of the letter to the local newspapers who ran it. Probably a human interest story as much as a potential health risk. I mean, it sounded a little bit crazy.
I mean, quite honestly, it seemed somewhat humorous because of just the nature of the dynamics. Of course, we had no idea that it would lead to something serious.
Coming up, the neighborhood feud takes a darker turn.
If they'll go so far as to drop a dead animal in your yard, what else will they do?
Hours after a neighborhood shooting left Todd Stevens dead, Minnesota police have the gunman in custody.
According to Todd's girlfriend, Jennifer, they were targeted by their neighbor across the street, Neil Zumberg, because he didn't like them feeding the wild deer.
Jennifer tells police the feud had been brewing for almost 10 years. And in 2012, Neil took his campaign of harassment to a new and disturbing level.
I come home, there's dead squirrel.
And when it's one dead animal, it's easy to think it's a coincidence, but it didn't stop there. Soon, there were all kinds of dead animals showing up in the yard.
Dead bird, a deer leg. 2 weeks later, another deer leg.
She apparently got fed up with it and decided to go to local law enforcement.
Jennifer was afraid. She petitioned the court for an order for protection, and they granted it.
However, a court order wouldn't prevent another incident from occurring in December of 2012.
It was a winter when there were 2 dead deer in Todd's lawn. We were just walking out to take our girls to the bus stop, and traumatic sight for them to see. Todd was already outside, Jennifer was outside. They clearly were frustrated, understandably so.
Can you imagine waking up and finding dead animals in your backyard? I mean, we have dogs, and sometimes we'll find little critters in the yard, easily explainable. But random animals in your yard, that's a whole different level. That's designed to scare you.
Police got involved and tried to figure out maybe who placed them there. Todd certainly thought Neil did it. Neil denied that. So a lot of indirect anger was placed towards each other.
Jennifer says when they confronted Neil, he threatened to kill them too.
There was a sort of a gradual escalation of things. You know, it went from veiled threats that stemmed from frustration out of their feud, that went to threats of violence.
You walk on and say, I'm going to kill you.
After that, Todd and Jennifer decided to install security cameras outside their house.
They were tired of the arguments and the police coming. So they put cameras up, and they faced those cameras to the Zumberg residence.
Once the security cameras went up, there were no more dead animals found in the yard, so that's telling.
But still, the threats continued.
By the spring of 2014, tensions had reached an all-time high. And that led to another confrontation with Neil's son, Jake.
There was a run-in at the Spring Lake Park VFW where Jennifer and Todd were playing bingo, and the Zumberg son, Jacob, was there and approached the couple.
Jennifer said he'd been drinking and accused them of giving his father Lyme disease. He was so angry and so aggressive that management kicked him out.
He said, I'm going to kill y'all and burn your house down.
They were legitimately afraid and called police. Jacob was gone by the time they got there, but cops said, call us if you see him again. And he was charged with making terroristic threats.
So the police already had Neil Zumberg in custody, but it makes you think, did the son have something to do with it and his father was just covering it up?
A week later, on May 5th, Jennifer ran into Jake again.
She had gone to pick up food at a local takeout place, and as she was leaving, Jacob came in.
Knowing that he had essentially gone off the grid for the last week and that the police wanted her to let them know, she called the cops.
Jake was arrested at the restaurant, and when Jake's mom, Paula, got wind of it, she was really angry at Jennifer.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back on this kind of a Hatfield to McCoy situation.
When Jennifer got home, about 8:30 p.m., Paula was right there and walked outside to confront her. Jennifer tried to diffuse it, or at least open it up to an actual conversation.
But according to Jennifer, Paula wasn't interested in talking.
She's like, I'll kill you myself.
There's no telling how far that altercation might have gone if Todd did not step in.
Jennifer said that when Todd came outside that he didn't say a word, he just came out silently and stood next to her.
For a moment, it seemed the situation had been diffused. Then, the first shots rang out.
Neil Zumberg suddenly came from around the corner of the house and started blasting them with the shotgun without any warning.
When she saw Todd going down, and I think just sort of looked up and realized that Neil was over there with the gun, and then she scrambled inside to call 911.
The bullets are coming through my front door. And Paula kept saying, shoot, 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 shoot. He was adding them on to shoot.
It's a harrowing story, and one that seems to fit the evidence gathered so far. But when detectives speak to Neil Zumberg, the story he tells is very different from anything they've heard so far. Coming up, was it murder or an act of self-defense?
He's threatening to kill me, my wife, my kids.
He said, I just had enough.
After surrendering to police, 57-year-old Neil Zumberg has been taken to the New Brighton Police Department for questioning in the murder of Todd Stevens.
We'd like to talk to you about what happened tonight, kind of what spurred you on, what happened with the argument. You feel like you can tell us the story?
I probably should.
It's up to you. We'd like to hear from you because we don't know.
There wasn't a whole lot of question that Neil had been the gunman. I mean, he called police. He surrendered. They just needed to secure the physical evidence to sort of corroborate his story.
Neil agrees with only two things Jennifer told police: what started the feud and what caused it to escalate.
This is all about deer, basically. New Brighton police won't do nothing. These people made our lives miserable, and then they just didn't do anything about it.
Like Jennifer, he says the relationship between their two families started out good. But when Todd built that deer feeder, Neil's life became a nightmare.
There was one deer, and then it turned into 5 deer, and then 10 deer, and then frickin' 20 deer, and then our whole lives turned into deer. I just wanted them to stop feeding the deer.
The Zumberg family would observe the deer coming through because their property abutted a railroad track, I believe, and some woods. So the deer would come out from that area across the Zumberg backyard.
Neil says he first tried putting up a fence to block the deer, but Todd retaliated.
Todd got really pissed off because he cut the fence that's on the trail that goes along our property, so the deer can get through there easier.
A little while after that, Neil says that he contracted Lyme disease. And the only logical reason seemed to be all the wild deer. He tried to warn his neighbors with the letter, but the Jennifer started to falsely accuse him with ridiculous accusations like leaving deer parts on his lawn.
It was just lies. They just wanted me to quit complaining about the deer. And the New Brighton police says, we just want you to stop. Just stop. We don't care what's right or wrong. This one cop told me to just stop it, So they're like, well, no, I'm not going to stop it. I got Lyme disease.
Neil says his illness, as well as the court order Todd and Jennifer had placed against him, affected his ability to work. And things only got worse.
Todd liked to work out in his garage, so he always had a bench press bar and would kind of blare the music and be lifting weights in the driveway. And it was always super loud and kind of way hyper masculine.
He also said that Todd was loud at parties at his house and shooting his guns.
I wanted to be a good neighbor. We just moved in, and he was all boom, boom, shooting his 30-30 up in the air. So it just went on and on. I mean, with them getting drunk and just making our lives miserable.
Officers had been called before, sometimes for the dispute between the neighbors, and sometimes to respond to domestic events over at Todd and Jennifer's house.
Police records appear to support Neil's claims. And Neil says that after he filed his complaints, Todd turned his violent aggression toward him.
He would get pissed off just because I complained about deer. He'd make threats, and they always instigate the.
According to Neil, his son Jake didn't start the confrontation at the park. Todd did.
It was Todd that was trying to pick a fight with him. He's done the same thing with my son Nick, threatened to kill me.
Neil says it all came to a head the night of the shooting, after his son Nick called to tell them Jennifer had Jake arrested.
She went out, I saw him pull up, and she goes, I'm going to go give them a piece of my mind. My wife went out. I said, no, just stay in the house. Next thing you know, they're swearing back and forth, and I came out.
He apparently grabbed the shotgun in case things got out of hand because he knew that Todd and Jennifer had guns at the house.
Neil said that he actually got that gun prepped a week before the actual shooting, loaded it, showed his wife how to use it, and stuck it under a couch in the living room in fear that things would escalate.
So he comes from around the side of the house, trying to keep out of sight. According to Neil, he's not planning on doing anything. He's just there just in case.
I was watching, making sure that they weren't going to shoot my wife or something. And this happened, man.
Neil claimed that he saw Todd saying something threatening toward Paula, something to the effect of, I'm going to kill her, fill in the blanks with some expletives.
He carries a gun and stuff, and they're screaming and yelling, and all he had his arm like this, and then he kind of went down like this, and I just, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he was armed.
That's when Neil opened fire.
His wife was in danger, so he just pulled the trigger, and with all the adrenaline going, he just kept on shooting until it was over.
What made today different? I don't know, just everything. All that put together? Fear. My wife's crying. She can't sleep at night. Fear of getting shot.
Neil didn't come across as a cold-blooded killer in the interview. Near the end, he even asked how Todd and Jennifer were doing. They hadn't told him yet.
Hopefully, he's all right. I got the feeling he's not. How about her? Huh? She's never been an intended target of anything.
But whether or not Neil intended to kill anyone, the fact remained that Todd was dead. The day after his surrender, Neil is charged with second-degree murder and attempted murder.
As for Neil's wife, Paula, police tracked her down at her mother's house. But when they brought her in for questioning, she lawyered up. She wasn't saying anything.
Prosecutors try to reach a plea agreement, but Neil refuses. So on May 8th, Paula Zumberg is also charged with aiding and abetting her husband's crimes. Coming up, two warring families face off in court.
This wasn't self-defense or a crime of passion. He planned to kill Todd Stevens.
Like I said, it's the Hatfields versus the McCoys.
Neil and Paula Zumberg have both been charged in the murder of their neighbor, Todd Stevens. Prosecutors believe the shooting was motivated by a long-standing feud between the two families.
While Neil Zumberg pulled the trigger, his wife Paula is charged with aiding and abetting the murder.
The allegation was that she was urging her husband to shoot.
Paula goes on trial first in August of 2014, 3 months after Todd's death.
Instead of trying her case in front of a jury, Paula's attorney pushed for a bench trial, which means the case would solely be decided by the judge. It was a strategic move.
Mrs. Zumberg would not do well in front of a jury. She's a very caustic individual. She's prickly. The jury would not accept her very well.
Todd's girlfriend, Jennifer Clevin, is the prosecution's star witness.
She told the same story she told police, but unfortunately, the testimony didn't play as well with the judge.
She initially claimed that Paula was egging him on. That was not corroborated by anybody else.
Neighbors had opened their windows or got out on their stoop to listen, and they never heard Mrs. Zumberg say, shoot the gun, shoot him.
Paula's attorney did not even have to call witnesses. He argued that the state did not prove its case against Paula, and the judge ultimately agreed.
Paula Zumberg is acquitted. A year later, in August 2015, Neil's trial gets underway. His charges have been upgraded to first-degree murder.
The first-degree premeditated murder is the highest level charge in Minnesota, and it carries an automatic life without parole sentence.
The state says Neil's actions in the week before the shooting did prove that this was not a case of self-defense or a crime of passion. He planned to kill Todd Stevens.
Had his gun ready, loaded under the couch. It had previously been in his basement, unloaded. He exited the window, took up a sniper position, and fired the weapon when there was no danger to himself or his wife. And that videotape is quite important.
The footage is grainy but chilling. It shows Paula coming out of her house and getting into a shouting match with Jennifer. In the background, Neil could be seen peeking 5 times before firing his shotgun.
The jury also hears damning statements made by Neil during his interrogation with police.
They should give me a medal here because the police were going over there all the time, right? Because of this domestic stuff.
It actually sounds like he's actually bragging about killing Todd. There's no remorse there at all.
And it's going to be used by the prosecution to build their case, again, to show that this was intentional. It pointed to a guy with a plan, that he wanted this guy gone and that he was willing to take it that far.
In a surprising move, Neil Zumberg decides to testify in his own defense and tell the jury his side of the story.
He reiterated that self-defense claim that he thought that Todd had a gun and was going to go for it and was going to use it to kill Paula.
In Neil's mind, he was fearful of Todd Stevens and what Todd Stevens could do to his family. He believed in his heart of hearts that his wife was in danger and pulled the trigger.
But as the prosecution points out, there's a glaring problem with Neil's story.
Todd didn't have a gun on him. He had a cell phone in a holster or a case on his belt. And so if he had reached for anything, it would have been that, which wasn't a danger to anybody.
Paula Zumberg, in my view, was never in danger. She never tried to retreat. Todd Stevens had just left the front door of his home. There was no reason to shoot the man.
After fewer than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returns with its verdict.
They found Neil guilty of first-degree murder, and they sentenced him to the mandatory term of life in prison with no chance of parole.
Jennifer said after the verdict that she was satisfied that there was justice for Todd, but that it was bittersweet because he's gone.
The result may not be a surprise, but Neil's reaction to it is.
At a sentencing hearing, Neil actually addressed the court and apologized for his actions. It's the first time he ever seemed to express remorse.
He told the court that he hadn't been entirely truthful. That came from a place of guilt. I mean, he said essentially that he needs to atone and he needed to take on more of the responsibility and that the victim's family deserved that.
I was happy to hear that the verdict came through like it did, and that there was admission on Neil's side.
One man's inability to peacefully resolve the conflict with his neighbors had torn two families and an entire community apart. But in the aftermath of the tragedy, the neighborhood along Knollwood Drive tries to return to normalcy.
The families are no longer in the neighborhood. I think everyone kind of sighed a breath of relief. Like, okay, we've got new families in the neighborhood. People feel safe. The Stevens family probably is still very sad, still reeling, still wondering why it had to end like this.
It was shocking, surprising, that all of these little things would really build up to a loss of life.
It shattered the community. It shattered a lot of communities. A lot of people are upset that this could happen.
This long beef over feeding deer in the neighborhood, I mean, it sounds preposterous. It's a good reminder to check yourself and don't take these things too seriously. It's just not worth it.